It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, I have with me my very wonderful co-host, Andy Grabner, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, Andy.
Hi. I'm actually surprised that you don't come up with something more hilarious than the last time.
You know, I forgot. It's been a while since we had a recording session, and I'm like, usually when we do it back to back, I like start getting snarkier. This time it's been a while, and I'm like,
I
forgot. Yeah, this is
like no insult, no nothing. What's wrong with you?
We're back to baseline.
Back to baseline, okay.
Yeah. You're not warmed up.
Good. Oh, our guest just made a mistake. He started speaking before he was introduced.
Oh my gosh.
Before he was, oh my gosh, we need to go.
Let me get that shock button.
No, but maybe that's actually a good segue, right? Because maybe we do it a little unusual today. We have a guest today, and Brian, today you're actually one US citizen against two Austrians.
I know.
Right? So yeah, don't be afraid. There won't be. Well, you are allowed to add a little more Arnold references today, like at least twice as many as you typically do.
I'll go with Mozart, but I don't know any good Mozart trivia.
All right.
So, I mean, he's better than Arnold.
But I'm very happy that we have Philipp Krenn. Krenn. I'll try to pronounce you in the English way, and I'm really sorry about that, Philipp. Philipp, a developer advocate at Elastic. I think you can probably do a much better job than me introducing you, because I already messed up your name. So Philipp, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thanks a lot. And as you could tell, once you invite me, you cannot shut me up anymore. So I will just get started early on here. So hi, I'm Philipp. I generally just skip my last name because that always leads to this weird pronunciation issue. So I have been with Elastic, company behind Elasticsearch, Kibana, etc., for more than 6 years. I was actually the first one in Austria, and I had my own country for some time. By now, I have to share.
You owned your own country?
Well, I was the only one in Austria, so I was always jokingly say like I own Austria for Elastic, even though I'm not sales or anything. But at some point I started to share my country, and we have like a dozen others or so in Austria by now, all in different functions since we are fully distributed. So it's a bit of a different culture approach. And well, I've been a developer advocate because I like to do conferences. So before COVID, I was doing like probably 220 travel days a year. So I was always going from one city in Europe to the next. That's why I know the conference season quite well. I have started to pick up again, but by now I'm leading the EMEA team and I need to spend a lot more time on internal stuff. So I guess I'm down to like 100 travel days a year or so now. Let's see. Hopefully, fingers crossed, COVID will stay light or whatever it is that it's doing. So we can actually do some stuff. And I think we also learned, in general, to be a bit more resourceful and do better planning around what is in person, what is virtual, what is the right mix. Though I think we're all still trying to figure out what is the right mix. At least that's my takeaway so far.
You know, I think unrelated to our topic, I think somebody has to write some sort of expose, tell-all style book of like life on the road as a conference speaker. Like the good, the dirty, the everything, you know, I think could be quite salacious, I imagine. But
I think my trick or tip is that I'm just good at suffering and I don't care so much. Or maybe that's the frugal approach that I was brought up in. I don't know. At least that's mine. Andy, what is yours?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's your friends should never believe that what you post on social media, that this is the real story behind it, because typically we only post the nice things when we travel to a new city. But there is long days, a lot of weekends also on the road where you don't have your regular, let's say, kind of rhythm, right? That others have. You don't go and do certain things on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday evening because you're always in a different place. I think it's good, at least for me, to find something though that you can do that makes you happy. For me, outside of doing conferences, it's dancing, right? I'll try to find my salsa spots in every city. Maybe you have something, Philipp, as well. What you like to do on a regular basis when you travel to new places?
So when I travel, I mostly just want to see the city and just walk around a lot. But it's true at home. You can actually tell that we're Austrian. So I'm doing Viennese Waltz. And I'm actually dancing for tourists and everything in Vienna still.
Wow.
Like I'm with a big dancing school, and I often do I'm a bit old by now, but the others are a bit younger. But we often do performances at balls and often for American tourists who come to visit, to show them like how Vienna really is. I'm never sure that's really how Vienna is, but I don't want to bash too much on the Americans, but it seems to be very popular with Americans. So it seems to be the Austrian wonderland that we're projecting here. So it's a bit like the nice pictures that you post on social media about conferences, is that you portray Vienna in a way that it was 100 years ago, and that's how we like it.
Well, yeah, we like to pigeonhole every city and every country into a specific time period of our ideal vision of it. So,
what an amazing story! Because I always tell people that Sound of Music is just an American invention, and now you come here and completely cliche the Austrian waltzing in Vienna.
I have never seen Sound of Music though.
Really?
No Austrian has seen Sound of Music.
I've seen it twice. I have to admit.
Maybe you have too many American colleagues, but I want to say the proper Austrians who don't interact too much with Americans, nobody even knows about Sound of Music.
Hey, quickly picking up on something you said and kind of switching over to the topic. Yes. Over the last couple of years, I think we managed to escape each other, even though we were presenting sometimes at the same conferences. But this year in July, we both finally saw each other in Stuttgart and at Java Forum Stuttgart. You had a presentation on Log4j, and I think it's obviously a pretty hot topic. But then, in preparation of this podcast, I actually looked at your blog post, which, by the way, we are going to link to. And I was browsing a little bit through kind of your more recent presentations that you did kind of this year and last year probably as well. And one really piqued my interest, and it was called, well, for two reasons. First of all, the title is Why is it always DNS, TLS, and bad configs? And the second thing is, it seems you're also a Harry Potter fan. And because in your slides, you used a lot of references to Harry Potter. But I'm really curious because Brian and I, right, we often have conversations with either our users or colleagues or even in podcasts and talk about, damn, why is it always the N+1 query problem that is bringing systems to a crash? Why is it always bad Hibernate that is wrongly configured that brings system to a crawl? And now you are telling us three things that I think we have not talked about, at least as much. Why is it always DNS, TLS, and bad configs? And I think I would like to talk about this and just get your perspective on what you see out there, and especially also what people can do to kind of secure themselves from actually these three things becoming a problem.
Yeah, so the Harry Potter reference is actually an interesting starting point. I've seen the movies and I think they're nice movies. I just wanted to make the talk a bit more fun. And the kind of starting point was, maybe you remember there is this scene where McGonagall says to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, why is it always the three of you when something happens? And for me, this is and in the slide deck, there's also a picture where there's DNS, TLS, and bad config written on them. Why is it always the three of you? And that's pretty much the picture I have in my head when something happens. And then I looked through some of the big outages that's happened over the last 2, 3, whatever years. Mm-hmm. And it is so often these three. I mean, people probably still remember that Facebook outage from a year ago where they took everything down, where they allegedly had to chainsaw back into the data center because they couldn't even access anything anymore because the system was so dead and down. And that was a mix of DNS and bad configs. And it just seems to be there are these underpinnings that we often like to forget that keep everything running. And a lot of these technologies are also super old. DNS is not new or fancy. It's this old thing that is actually quite smart. So it actually works around quite a few things. So I recently read a blog post where somebody tried to point two CNAMEs at each other. So it's a.foo.com points to b.foo.com and the other way around to create a loop. But for example, DNS is smart enough to figure stuff like that out. So DNS is not stupid. It's just very old and badly understood. And that's, I think, why, for example, it's so often done wrong. Or TLS has the classic problem that it's A, complex, and then B, stuff always expires and nobody checks for that. And we could do a bit of a better job to do that because it's kind of straightforward, but we always forget like some important certificate somewhere in the back end that nobody checks or nobody sees. And when then it runs out, everything suddenly stops. And then it's probably nobody who has access to that can regenerate it that weekend or whenever it happens. So it's always a bad combination of things. But I think coming from my background is part in ops and running infrastructure. And these are things that I always feel close to my heart. And I feel like we're often spending so much time on like the fancier problems. And N+1 queries are not even the fancier problems, but we spend so much time on, I don't know, you're doing something stupid in your application and your tracing can show it and whatever. But oftentimes it's like the cheaper and almost dumber stuff that goes wrong. And then it's not just like one page fails or one page is slow, but it's like your entire application is dead. Those kind of things in infrastructure that can hit you.
Well, also because I guess, DNS and TLS are just so fundamental to everything. And it's like, if we don't have electricity anymore, that's fundamental. Nothing works anymore. If DNS is misconfigured, you brought up the examples.
Yeah. Or the other fun thing is that's what I have done wrong in a previous job is where I configured like the wrong name servers, or I copied for multiple domains, and for some domains it was the wrong name server. And then because of the timeout, everything works and works and works until it doesn't. And then you can just watch as stuff kind of like disappears from the internet. And then you know that it will take the timeout again until you can actually fix it. So you can just sit there and watch and fiddle your thumbs to wait until stuff works again, which is like a very interesting attribute of DNS. It's not just like, oh, we'll just redeploy the new application and it's fixed and done and we move on. But the time to live of DNS, for example, is something that's kind of also like its own interesting problem. And I feel like observability is the fancy new thing, and everybody thinks in like these complex tools that we have. And then like DNS and TLS are very classic monitoring things. It's like you ping the certificate, how long is it still valid? If it's less than 100 days, send somebody an email or start shouting or whatever, so it gets fixed. It's not sexy or new or anything, but it's still like the fundamentals that we get wrong so often. That's why I kind of like the talk, or just to say like, oh, it's not just this fancy stuff and OpenTelemetry and all the new things that we can do, and it's the great new world, but oftentimes it's the fundamentals that will catch up with us again.
You also did a great job in your slides, I think, to also provide examples, right? How you can write a simple synthetic test that actually, validates if your certificate is still valid. Like you bring up some good points on, check it on a daily basis, and then 100 days before, 60 days before, whatever, you're then sending alerts and kind of raising the awareness. I'm just wondering why, we are also representing obviously a monitoring or observability company, you as well, right? It's like, if why don't we make it easier then for people to automatically do these things? We should put these checks into the system by default and just help people. Unless you say this is counterproductive, because then people actually forget that these things exist. And then we kind of run into the situation that nobody understands these technologies anymore. And if then something breaks, nobody knows how to fix it. Like a chicken and egg problem a little bit.
Yeah, my take is that it's like we're always running after the new hotness and look at what I can do and what I can figure out. And this is so cool and so smart. It's almost like conference-driven development where you just pick up the latest and greatest from the conference. And we often forget, I think good old Nagios could do stuff like that already. And nobody wants to use Nagios anymore. And it's just like, it's kind of like a solved problem, and then you forget about it. And then it's fighting you again.
So CDD, conference-driven development, but in your role, aren't you kind of feeding this whole thing? Because you are showing new cool stuff, I guess. You also talk about these fundamental things, which is important, but I assume you also show new cool stuff, and then hopefully not inspiring too many people to just look at the new cool stuff. Yeah,
so I will just point at the other side now. It's like somebody shows the cool stuff, which is fine, but it's not how you should build your product or your production environment. You shouldn't just take what somebody has shown you what looks great at first. I think there's a fine line or mix between showing what is kind of like possible, but also only picking what is mature. And for example, that's something that I think is important, that I will generally only try to show stuff that I believe are reasonable to use in production or whatever, and not something like, oh, we built something and it feels half-baked or it solves the wrong problem. Then I will generally try not to actually demo or show that. Like everybody, we have some things that are just in the making, or maybe that are also never going to make it out of the making because you need to experiment. And I generally try to stay away from those. I think that's kind of the responsible thing to do, not just show like what is hot, but also like what is potentially reasonable to use. But obviously, everybody, like we always like to say, it depends on what is the right solution for you. So everybody will need to decide for their environment and their skills and tool set and whatever, what is the right thing. So I think it's like a two-sided argument here. Who is responsible?
Yeah. I still love your CDD, conference-driven development. It's an awesome term. And I think, Brian, you were also chuckling when he said this.
I also like what you said too. I was going to say another fundamental along with that was you said, I'm not going to show you something that's not solving the right problem. And I think that's another key thing is before demonstrating something or even before using a new tool or functionality. It's like, well, what are you trying to solve for? And I don't think enough people are asking that question. They just want to use that cool new thing. And that applies not just in development, but any situation I do all this audio production and I throw in these cool plugins because they're cool. I'm like, well, what am I actually trying to do? I put it on to see what I could do instead of thinking what I want ahead of time. Anyhow, I think those go hand in hand, the conference-driven development and what problem are you trying to solve? Those are fantastic. Yeah, we can end here. It's an awesome show, but let's keep going.
Just to add on top of that, I always say like part of the job is to make people successful, and successful can be to solve their problems or to show them what is possible. But by showing them the wrong stuff that leads into a dead end or brings them into a spot that is not so great, I think you're not doing yourself or your company or your product a favor by leading people into something that looks good but will not stand the test of time or might not go so well in production. I think that's part of the making people successful. And just one other small addition, like next to the conference-driven development, there's also the CV-driven development, where people just throw everything into their production just to say afterwards, like, I have used these list of tools. And that's how we end up with these zoos of technology of what people often use, which is, by the way, great for tool providers like us, because somebody needs to actually make sure that stays up and running in production afterwards. So it's there's something in there for everybody.
Yeah. I think the DNS thing, there's an analogy I was thinking of it, but that analogy then brought up another problem, right? So the analogy I was thinking of was tickets for an event, right? So before we had apps, we actually, had to get printed out tickets. And I know it happened to everybody at some point. You do all your prep, you get all your stuff ready, whether or not you're going to go have a party in the parking lot ahead of time or whatever. You have all your stuff ready. You arrive at the parking lot and like, oh my God, I forgot my tickets at home, right? The fundamental, the DNS, like the underlying thing, one of the most critical things, that's just the basic, not all the little, I got my little hibachi grill and XY, all these other things. So there was a great solution for that, right? Which was the app. Now you don't have to worry. Like you have your phone, you have the app, but two things happen there is number one, maybe you didn't download the app and now you're at the event, which may or may not have poor reception. But if the app is down, right? Now everyone's hit. So when you're looking at those solutions, you talk about, can you use a different tool? Do you use the old tools? Do you need people who just fundamentally know and understand these things? I think that makes the case that you do need those people to fundamentally understand it, because when the easy button for those technologies fails in some way, you have to be able to fall back on somebody, the old guy with the spider webs on him in the corner who still knows how to do this stuff manually.
Or you have taken 100 selfies and you're out of battery now.
Yeah.
Hey, Philipp, coming back to the presentation. So DNS, we covered DNS, we covered TLS. You also talked about bad configs, even though, in general, I think, like DNS, you brought up your own example. Sometimes, it's config problems that lead to this. Any other examples that you have where you say, hey, I would wish that this doesn't happen anymore, and this is why I explain it to the people in my talk?
I think your N+1 is a great example, because that's also been plaguing us as an industry for a long time. And then you have whatever abstraction for your ORM that is potentially doing that or doing other weird stuff. So I think, it's the little things that we tend to overlook because in theory they're solved, but in practice they're not, or it's like the case of the bad YAML indentation or whatever. What would be my example for bad configs? Everybody running Kubernetes has, I don't know how many thousands of lines of YAML lying around somewhere, and I don't know if all of those are correct or doing the right thing. But I feel like there is, as an industry, we're not moving away from making it easy to make some of those mistakes, I think. We keep piling on new layers on top of them. And then we kind of like forget about the old problem, but they are still lurking down there somewhere to take stuff down. And I guess everybody who has been running something in production has been there to run some bad configuration. And it's always a combination of 2 or 3 things. Like one thing alone is normally not enough to throw you off, but it's normally 2 or 3 things combined just make the right mix to create utter chaos.
Could we solve this problem in a way? I'm just throwing out an idea. I know OpenTelemetry, you brought this up, or distributed tracing, however you get to the trace. Let's assume we get framework vendors or framework developers like those that are providing Hibernate or other abstraction frameworks. We get them to, on the one side, instrument their frameworks with, let's say, OpenTelemetry. And wouldn't it be cool if there would be another standard on top of OpenTelemetry where you can define bad patterns? Because if you get a distributed trace and that distributed trace shows me the n+1 query problem, one SQL statement and then 5 times, 10 times, 100 times the same, this should be a pattern that should kind of flag that distributed trace later on and say, hey, this is something you may want to look at, and maybe you're not even aware of it, but based on how we intended this framework, this is a distributed trace that you should probably not see. And I was wondering if, you have some knowledge now on certain frameworks and how things behave and should behave, and then we detect patterns if something is abnormal. We have other countless examples of because we've been analyzing distributed traces for many years. Wouldn't it be cool if we could just say, hey, we solve with OpenTelemetry, we solved the collection problem, but now we need to figure out a way how to let people and framework providers define what is normal and what is an abnormal pattern?
I guess. I feel like we're not there yet. I feel like OpenTelemetry has been very much about like data collection. But then once you hit like the backend, then it's like every vendor is on their own and doing their own thing and way. And it took a long time until the data collection was standardized because nobody reasonable wants to have all that vendor specific stuff in their application and kind of like locks them into one vendor so much. So I think that was an easy sell, like the sell to tell people, oh, there's this open standard for detection and figuring out what's going on. I could see that, but I also feel like it's a harder to sell to kind of like the end user because they're like, as long as it does the right thing, I don't care how it's standardized. It's not in my application. And I feel like for a vendor, you're not necessarily like there are not a lot of incentives to share the secret sauce because right now I feel like that is kind of like the secret sauce what sets apart the different vendors. I guess it would be interesting. I just feel like it's a hard starting point to say because that's the new unique value proposition of the different tools that, we get OpenTelemetry data. This is how we can search it, query it, alert on it, whatever. There it's deeply in the vendor land. Or maybe I'm just thinking too much from the vendor perspective, but I have the feeling that the incentives there are maybe not as strong. And from the end user, there's maybe not as much push because it's like not in your application.
But I think, Andy, if I'm understanding it right, my take on that would be that this wouldn't be, from the vendor perspective, it wouldn't be the full scope of how the platform analyzes. There would be a small portion dedicated to open analysis, let's call it, I don't know, that can ingest a predefined pattern from a vendor that we know these certain patterns occur in our situation. When you ingest your code, you can also upload this to your tool if they support it. And your tool will still do all the cool things you do, but one small section of it will be able to ingest these. And when a problem arises, it can then cross-check it to, is it one of these patterns? Hey, we know it. It's already defined. Bam. So it would only be on those known and existing patterns that vendors supply or other ones people put out there. But then you still have to do all the magic because, let's face it, 99% of the time, things are like hidden behind a million other things or they are different problems. I mean, it is kind of scary how often it is the same problem at the end of the day. But obviously, it's a lot more complex.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of my thinking, right? Coming back to the analogy, maybe, right? If you think about a car, and you have an engine, and then the engine probably has some specifications. The engine should be operating in a certain temperature range, right? This is something that I can then measure and then alert on. But if the engine is put into a car, then you need some additional, logic that makes sure that whichever person is driving is not hitting a speed limit, but the speed limit depends on where you actually drive. So this is then where let's say more intelligence comes in, and where you need more data and then to make better recommendations to the driver. I'm just saying, right, if we are providing a framework and the framework is observable, then why not give at least a framework of, we think as a framework provider, the framework should be used kind of in with these constraints, or it should run, like it runs normally if we see this, and runs abnormally if we see that. But maybe I'm going off in the wrong direction. Yeah.
Well, just to round out on your car idea, I think, cars have that already. You hook up the computer to your car, and for the common things, like your oxygen sensor or whatever, the things that they can know about that are measurable and simple, that's something like that is standards. I mean, I can definitely see a battle between vendors on this idea. Like, it's not, that's more of a very optimistic outtake of big money capital and sharing, which would be awesome if it does, right? But who knows?
And I feel like that would be like a classic log statement, no? Like something sees, like you have like a recursive invocation to some degree. You could potentially just do a warn logging. I feel like the tooling is almost there. And I'm also like slightly torn if like the tool should even allow that, or should require a special flag for some of these things. Like the N+1 query problem it's of course hard in the end, but I feel like in theory, this is like a known thing that you have like one query runs more than 10 other queries. That's like a really weird sign normally, or not something you want to have in most cases. So maybe it should fight back harder from the start.
Yeah, I know, but the same with expired certificates, right? It should be a fixed problem, but yet it brings down very popular websites every year. And this is all right. Switching gears a little bit, because we all are very interested in making systems observable, and through different means of looking at different types of data. One of your recent talks, and this is the one I think you also had in Stuttgart, was around Log4j, right? I think we don't need to explain what Log4j is and Log4Shell and the exploits, because Brian, I believe we've covered this a little bit in previous episodes. But I would just like to get your take on it. What you are, because I unfortunately haven't seen your talk. I kind of clicked through the slides a little bit, but I haven't seen your talk. I'm just interested in your role as a developer advocate. What do you advise people to avoid these problems in the future? What kind of best practices do you give them? Yeah,
so my talk is actually kind of like almost broken into two parts, because Elasticsearch plus Logsearch to some degree have been using Log4j for logging for a long time, and were almost affected by it, but especially Elasticsearch not because of the Java Security Manager. And that's kind of like what is like the first part or half of the talk almost. It's like looking at, why is it hard to detect that this is a problem or not a problem? So for example, those who are not aware, the Java Security Manager is, unfortunately, it's going away, but it's basically something where you can create your own sandbox to some degree of what you can do from a Java application. And the sandbox that we have put in place is that only very few packages of Elasticsearch, for example, can do a network call. So our network library is Netty, and Netty can do outgoing network calls or can bind to an interface and whatever. Most other pieces of the code cannot do that. For example, our logging library cannot do networking calls, except for DNS lookups. But that's why, for example, an Elasticsearch is not a remote code execution, because it just cannot fetch remote code. It could only use code that is already around and work with that, but it could not reach out to any system to load any remote code, which I think is interesting how you can generally solve that problem. So even if you have bad security issues, and like we can discuss for a long time if a logger should even have these features or not, how can you as an application developer or provider, especially if you have widely used tools, can protect against stuff like that? just to say, for example, like my logging library doesn't need to write to the network. It needs to write the file. That's pretty much all it needs to do. It shouldn't have the rights to do other stuff. Like why is that not a more common thing? And why is it actually very hard to get right? And why it took us a long time to get to that point? And then, of course, the second part is more on the detection side, where we have basically, I think, two angles, where from the observability side, where we can see what is the application doing. Is it like it's suddenly doing network calls to some other IPs or DNS names that it shouldn't, which is definitely a weird sign. And you can suddenly see it's doing a get on whatever code, and then it's being executed. So that's not a good sign. And the other thing is, since we have more security tooling around that now as well, we can actually see the processes, and we could see that the Java process, for example, spawns another shell or whatever out of the Java process, which is also not what you commonly do in your web applications, that you spawn out and then do another wget or whatever people are running. So we have that second side of how to protect against that. But the first half is more like how do we protect our own products or make them more secure by default, which I think is something we as an industry also haven't made a lot of progress in. Like there's a lot of theory out how to write more secure programs. And I mean, very few or almost nobody manages memory manually anymore. Like they're even in C++, you have proper tooling around that anymore. So we have made some progress, but some other stuff that is, again, surprisingly simple. Like, why don't we limit what can do network calls or what system calls are even possible from an application? Why is that not more widely used? And I guess it's because most of us just want to ship fast.
But I think you bring up a really good point, and I think sometimes people that complain about why is it so hard to get these permissions, why don't we have just everything on because they want to ship faster. I think these stories are then a great reminder that there are reasons why by default we block as much as possible, and actually at the end you have to ask for permission. You have to grant an additional permission if you need to make a certain call consciously, right? And I think that's the great piece or the great advice, and kind of the reminder that there's a reason why we are very restrictive. And I think that's a great point. Then I also want to highlight that because, maybe not everybody is a Java expert like you are, maybe, but maybe they are responsible in fighting things like this. You talked about the Java Security Manager, that this is a component that allows you to define what's possible and what's not. And you said it's going away in favor for something else, or?
They don't have a proper replacement, but it's so that the problem with the Java Security Manager was that it was not very widely used, and it created like both development work, and it was always a bit scary for us because there are very few Java projects that are using it heavily. So it doesn't get the exposure that we would like to see from others. And well, it's going away. And we are working on replacements around better modularization in code and what can invoke what, and like to have a bit more boundaries between code. And so if you have a vulnerability in one part, that it will not kind of like own the entire process, for example. So there is work in progress. We'll see how to get to that. We have some people who are very deep in the Java ecosystem to work on that. I think Oracle and others are also still building a bit more in that area. But I think the official take is that the Java Security Manager was interesting. It was just too much work for the average application to use it. And that's kind of why it has failed. And we're not really happy about that because it really saved our bacon with Log4Shell. But we can also see that it's not as widely used as we would want or others on the JVM would want. So it's maybe not the right abstraction, or it's not the right thing right now. And we'll see where that ends up. But it was one of the very cool features of the JVM, I would say. What I've
seen at conferences, people present, and I guess, again, I'm not a security expert at all, so I'm just consuming information, and hopefully I kind of repeat it now in the correct way, but people have shown using eBPF to basically then block calls when an application is opening up a port or it's opening up, making requests, right? That's one option. And then obviously policy managers, right? If you think about Kubernetes with policies, or also the privileges that the service account has, you can really restrict an environment very nicely. So what it can and what it cannot do.
It's just ties into like different environments. And then it's like, oh, you need to have something on the Kubernetes level, and then you have eBPF, but that depends also on depending on the kernel version, and then what do you do on Windows? Whereas in a JVM, it was like just one thing that you had to do once, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's, I mean, I think again, like in most cases, there are like 100 options. It's just like what is efficient and like manageable. We'll see. But we already have like, for example, we do system call filtering. Like Elasticsearch couldn't fork another process. That's just like we don't give the process the permission because we don't need to fork another process out of Elasticsearch. It's not a thing.
This conversation reminds me, not that I lived through it, but if you think back in the Industrial Revolution era, right, where you had these factory floors with conveyor belts and spinning machine parts, people working all under it. You had fires, burning stuff inside, no ventilation, no lighting. It was a very unsafe workspace, but it was designed to get stuff out the door quickly. Right, it was designed for max, but the danger level was tremendous. And Andy, we've had discussions in the past, especially once DevOps came up and we started talking about the Toyota factory model, right? But in general, there's different changes during the course of history, whether you're going from agriculture, industrial to compute. They all go through these same cycles. Like N+1 moves from database to services, right? Similar kinds of situations. And I feel like what we're discussing here is the idea of instead of safe workspaces, safe code spaces, where you have now, instead of the open belts flying all around, now they're encased in a case. So that if they snap, they're not going to chop someone's head off. You have ventilation. So all the exhaust going on in the place, you're monitoring your DNS, you're locking down the firewall first. You have to get the permission. And it feels like on the compute industry, there needs to be, not quite regulation in that terms, but there needs to be these standardizations to make it a safe space for code, for execution and all that stuff, while still being efficient. You brought up that the other idea with the Java piece where it just wasn't performing and people weren't using it well because it wasn't, designed well. All right, that's where you go back to the drawing board then to find a new way to do it that people actually adopt, because you can only get to that place if people adopt it. And it's just stewing in my mind how it's always the same thing all over again, right? It's just a new environment. Same thing though. Let's
hope it doesn't take 100 years.
Yeah, we're on a much different time scale these days, right? Everything is reduced in time.
On the other hand, I feel like security has been like a lingering problem, and we have just gotten used to it just has to hit you every now and then, or it's like, isn't it? Are you still using the magnetic strip on credit cards in the US? Like in Europe, I think we mostly got rid of them, but in the US, do you use them for a long time?
Yeah, we used them for a lot longer than you did. Some cards still have them, but most of the times they're just, most stores have the chip reader or the contactless one. I think it's just more the old stores. I think that the bigger issue on that is going back to adoption is the stores are responsible for buying the new machine. So if you're a small store without budget, you're like, am I going to pay for that? What's my incentive? Yeah, and this goes back to the same thing though, right? What's my incentive to go ahead and use this new safe coding thing? Log4j was a fantastic. Like, I don't think we heard too much devastation come out of it. At least I hadn't, right? We knew it was there. We knew everyone was exposed, but we didn't hear any horror stories on the news of companies getting terribly compromised. So that was really fortunate, but it was also fantastic that it happened, because to your point, it was a real kick in the ass for security, right? People who weren't paying much attention, it was everywhere then, so we do need those for sure.
The thing is, right, we probably also don't know which of the attacks. I mean, there's constant reports. Also, Philipp, in Austria, we recently had attacks against certain public agencies, but nobody reports on it. What was the tech? Like, how did they get in? Maybe, who knows? Maybe they were already in, but then these organizations just wait for the right moment to strike, right? So
you never know if it's just a stupid phishing attack or if it's something sophisticated.
Yeah.
I'm not taking any bets for our public sector.
Yeah. Hey, Philipp, I wanna kind of go into the final stretch here, but we talked about past conference presentations, and folks, again, we will put the link to your website, where you also explain why your website is called Xera, or why your Your name is everywhere as Xera, which is interesting. I won't spoil it here. People should go to your website. But on your website, you also have upcoming conferences. And if I look there, DevOps Days Berlin, Chuck Saxony Day, DevOps Days Portugal. Actually, you're doing this session. But then you have a couple of talks where you also talk about open telemetry, the state of open telemetry for Java developers. And also one that I think is really interesting, Kubernetes debugging Kubernetes operators. And I feel these are all interesting topics I would quickly like to talk about, but I want to give you the chance to pick one of those and say, this is the session that I'm most excited about in the upcoming months. And, and this is the reason why.
We can pick the Kubernetes operator. I mean, I'm excited about all of them, and I actually need to add a couple more now. I've fallen a bit behind from updating that list. So I think there should be more. But the Kubernetes operators is like, I feel like I just got very efficient at creating talks. That's how that talk started. Because so we have, for our stuff, we have an operator that's getting a lot of development time. And then there was the problem that our support team had to support that in production with users. And then they were like, we're not Kubernetes experts. We don't really know much about an operator. How do we even start supporting that? We're Elasticsearch experts or whatever. And then they basically had an internal training or like a scenario of how to debug common problems. And I don't want to say I stole it, but I looked at those and I kind of like took an inspiration, because basically in support, they figured out like these are the most common scenarios that we see what people are doing wrong and how to debug them. And that's what our support people should know. And my take then is I take those materials, and maybe you don't even need to open the support case, but you can actually figure that out yourself. And I think that what we do there applies very widely to other operators. It's like you have a bad reference. You could create actually more complex error scenarios, like where you do stuff across namespaces and then you hit the bug and then stuff gets deleted if you delete it in one namespace, but it should stay in the second one. But I think it's more about the basics that, like most other tools, it's like at first you're like, I have no idea how this works. I don't even know where to start. And you're kind of like in this state of shock and you're frozen. And I think that's not even true for Kubernetes. It's like any other system. Like you need a couple of tools and points to get started. And then you just start poking at it. And then you see like, oh, this looks wrong, or there is an error message that looks interesting and where I can go from there. So it's more about like showing people like, oh, this is not totally different. It's like the commands are a bit different, and you need to remember maybe these 5 commands or run these 5 things. And then you can see like, oh yeah, there's this problem, or I can see what is going wrong here. And then sometimes you need to tie it back a bit more to fundamental concepts in Kubernetes, like, oh, how is storage attached or whatever. But it's still a simple enough starting point that if you do a kubectl describe and then the resource, then you often see like, where are you even? It's like, I don't know, in the good old Linux days, you would do a PS or you would do a grep or whatever. So you also have like a handful of commands that you just knew, and you would run and you would just start poking at the system, and then you would figure stuff out. And I think it's kind of like the same for Kubernetes. The problem with Kubernetes is like it has a few more layers, and then you can go lower, and you might need to know more overall because it's so many layers. But just like looking at the topmost layer and the most obvious things, I think is not completely different just to debugging something on plain Linux service. It's more like transitioning from this is the other stuff I know, and then, okay, I need to know a couple of commands, but then I can kind of like transfer what I've done in the past. I can transfer over to this new environment, just because everybody needs to use Kubernetes nowadays. And I'm still a bit unconvinced if that is true for everybody, or if we're abusing or overusing that. But it's what everybody needs to do. So I'm kind of like following along and say like, if you fail or run into problems, let's take a look at how you can actually dig your way out again. And like I said, I kind of like shortcuts or efficiency. So I'm looking at like, this is what support sees. That's probably a good starting point to turn into a talk. So that's where I got this from.
Really cool. And thanks for sharing these details. And folks, again, there will be, I guess, even more chances to see Philipp in the next upcoming weeks. It's amazing still the things that you already have on the list. And if there's even still missing, then it's even more amazing that you are able to cover all of this because it's a lot of traveling.
Let's see where we meet the next time.
Exactly. I was trying to get to go to Berlin, but this didn't happen, and now something else came up. But I'm pretty sure we cross paths again in real life, and then maybe, who knows, maybe we find a dancing spot. Even though I did ballroom a lot, but now I'm more on Latin dance, salsa. That's my genre. But
yeah, I only can know the basic step of salsa.
Yeah, it's good
Andy,
enough.
you'll have to wear a powdered wig. and puffy sleeves, right?
Philipp, did we miss anything? Is there any final thoughts for our listeners that you would like to tell them? Or
no, I mean, I hope we did well for the listeners, but I think we covered a lot of ground, from Austrian culture all the way to computer stuff. So if you ever visit Vienna, check out for the guy in the glasses who is dancing waltz, probably in the first district somewhere with tourists.
And then run up and stick a screen of Sound of Music playing in front of him. This way he can't claim he's never seen it. Force him to watch it.
I need to. I only know the meme, right? There is this where the one person is on the I don't know, it's like dancing in the traditional skirt or whatever. Like I know that meme, but that's pretty much all I know.
Right.
Well, it's a very Americanized version of that time period for sure. Yeah. What are you going to do? That's America. Anyway,
I blame it on the generation.
Yeah, let's blame it on the boomers, even though that wasn't them making those then. We'll still blame it on them, right? This has been fascinating. You said you hope it resounds for our audience, but as Andy and I always say, like we love doing this because of what we get out of it, right? We hope the audience comes along with us on the ride. We don't really hear too much feedback, so I found this fascinating and really, really appreciate you taking the time from your busy tour schedule. You have to open for the Rolling Stones someday.
I'll make a shirt at some point, right?
Yeah, start selling merch and you have a tour with all the dates on the back.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Andy, anything you wanted to wrap with, or we're good?
No, just reminding people, check out the notes. Yes. We will put the links to the blog, to your LinkedIn, to your Twitter, to your GitHub. There's everything. I mean, you can find everything anywhere on your website, xeraa.net. That's XERAA.net. But again, you'll find the link there as well. And once this episode airs, obviously, Philipp, we will put it on social media, tag you, so then your followers will find it, and then our followers can then also follow you, and then hopefully everybody's happy.
And we all make money. No,
exactly.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks to our listeners. Really had a great time, and see you on the next episode, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.